So, Britain, a nation of homeowners, has for decades neglected the position of tenants, increasingly handing power back to landlords. In continental European countries where renting is the norm, tenants have the right to improve their properties and greater rights to avoid eviction. Efforts to regulate the private rental sector were abandoned by the coalition government in 2010. But right now, given house prices are out of reach for millions of ordinary Britain, is it time to strengthen the hand of generation rent? To talk about this is Diane Abbott, MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, who says it's time to look at rent controls, and Richard Blanco, a private landlord with 10 flats and houses across London, including the borough of Hackney. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Richard Blanco. Have you ever evicted anyone on housing benefits because you were worried that they'd be in arrears?
No, I certainly haven't. And, the idea of evicting all of your tenants on housing benefit because they might fall into arrears is frankly ridiculous. It's true that a lot of landlords are worried about tenants on benefits at the moment because under the new regime with universal credit, benefits will be paid directly to the tenant. And with the cap that's been brought in as well, there's a concern that tenants won't have enough money to pay the rent. And certainly in a lot of inner London boroughs, we're seeing families with a shortfall of £80 per week.
So just to be clear, if there's talk of the cuts of housing benefits, does that make you more likely to evict tenants in the future?
Well, I think, no landlord wants to evict their tenants. It's only as a last resort. Of course, if a tenant simply cannot pay the rent, then usually the landlord will speak to the tenant and talk about what can be done. But, if they're not receiving enough benefit to pay the rent, then what else can the landlord do ultimately?
Diane Abbott, what would you have done as a politician to protect the rights of that woman who was evicted for complaining about a radiator?
Well, I think you can't look at the problems of generation rent without looking at the housing market as a whole.
But specifically, what would you have done to help her?
Well, let me explain. Part of her problem, people make this artificial distinction between people who are working and people on benefit. Actually, the majority of new housing benefit claimants since 2010 are working, and it's working people like that young woman who are faced with eviction because of changes in housing benefit, which obviously the Labour Party opposes. But because your home is more than a business transaction.
But what legislation would you introduce if you were in power in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening?
You have to look at the housing market as a whole. I would have a levy on non-domiciled buyers, because one of the things that's distorted the housing market in London is all these very rich people buying in Zone 1. I would allow councils to borrow money to build, and I'm afraid we have to look at rent controls. Landlords go white when you mention rent controls, but they have them in New York. It's not a socialist republic. We have to look at some controls on rents.
If we introduce rent controls, would you be in the renting market?
Well, I'm afraid I don't think rent controls are the answer. The last time we had rent controls in the 70s and 80s, the private rented sector dropped to 7%. It's now 18%, and it's been growing, and it is very healthy now and continues to grow. The problem with rent controls is that landlords wouldn't be able to get mortgages, and a lot of them would drop out of the business. What we need are for the government to enable more building of houses and for planning laws to be freed up so that we can increase supply.
I agree, we need to build more council houses, but rent controls, you do have them in a city like New York. Even if you just say that rents can't go up in a given year more than the rate of inflation, that would be a real relief to generation rent.
But we tried rent control in the past and it just didn't work.
It was a very different era. It was a very different era. You had a lot more council housing stock around. Do you know how high rents in London have shot up? The gap between salary and rents in London is ridiculous. I'm not saying rent controls on their own, but I am saying we have to look at it.
But the whole environment of buy-to-let virtually is a kind of investment lottery. The situation of the housing market, especially in London, was created under the last Labour government, especially under Gordon Brown.
As you may know, I don't agree with everything the last Labour government did, and we do.
But that's where the legacy started.
We can look back or we can look forward to all the people well into their 30s who are having to rent because they can't get a foot on the housing market. We have to do something about overseas buyers. We have to allow councils and others to build more houses, but we have to look at protecting tenants.
Richard Blanco, you've never had it so good, have you? Mortgages are low. The housing stock is basically stuck. You've got foreign buyers who are coming in. You've got an increasing number of people who are desperate to rent. These are good times for you, aren't they?
In some ways, yes, but mortgage finance has been very hard to come by. We've got an increasing levels of bureaucracy by local authorities introducing licensing schemes and banning shared housing through Article 4 directions. And actually, rents have peaked in London now. They did rise by 7% in 2012, but in the last year, they've only risen by around 2%. And I think certainly as we see more people starting to sell houses this spring, we'll see those people that are stuck in renting starting to buy.
OK, got to leave it there. Richard Blanco, Diane Abbott, thank you very much indeed. Now,